This morning's scripture reading comes from Luke 8. We'll be starting in verse 43 and reading through 48, I believe. And as Jesus went with them, the crowd pressed around him, including a woman who had suffered from bleeding for 12 years. She had spent all her money on physicians, but no one was able to heal her. And she came up behind Jesus and touched the fringe of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. But they all denied it. "Master," said Peter, "the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus declared, "Someone touched me, for I know the power has gone out of me." Then the woman, seeing she could not escape notice, came trembling and fell down before him in the presence of all the people. She explained why she had touched him and how she had immediately been healed. "Daughter," said Jesus, "your faith has healed you. Go in peace."
If you hadn't had a chance to read the bulletin article yet, you won't understand this next statement maybe, but we're preparing to make a trip, or we have been preparing to make a trip, a vacation trip, and we're going out west to a place that's less crowded, we hope, and that's one of the reasons why we chose that place, because it was maybe less crowded. And in the middle of all the stuff that's going on in the world, less crowded sounded pretty good. I don't know, social distancing. I think in Wyoming you can social distance pretty well. It's about, I think, 3 times the size of Arkansas, and it's got about the population of Pulaski County. So that allows you to social distance pretty well. Anyhow, having said that, we're getting ready for the trip. And you know the very first thing you do when you prepare for a trip like that, after you make your plans, you call and you say, "Hey, I need to make sure my flight reservations are right." So I made the flight reservations. I get a text message from my wife that says, "Do you realize you're not taking me?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She says, "It says George Hulett in seat number 1 and George Hulett in seat number 2. So I called the airline and they said, "Well, those were the last 2 seats available for the flight. If you cancel them, then we can rebook them, hopefully," which they were able to do. So that was the first thing. The first thing you do is make sure you've got a flight. The next thing is, it's 2,000 miles of travel from point A to point B. You need a car to drive, so make sure the rental car is available, and we took care of that. The next thing is, it's 2,000 miles of travel. You need a place to sleep. So we made sure we had a place to sleep. But you know what the other important thing was that we had to make sure of? I called the West Yellowstone Church of Christ. Looked them up on the website, and they had one of the elders and his wife's phone numbers were posted on their webpage along with the preacher. So I called the elder's number. He didn't answer, so I called his wife, and she answered, and I said, "Just wanted to know, in the middle of this crisis, are y'all still worshiping?" And she said, "Oh, yes." She said, "We are." And she told us the worship times. Happens to be about 2 or 3 blocks from the hotel where we're staying. We're looking forward to that. And she says, and we're a really, really small congregation, so we have no problem social distancing. I laughed a little bit at that. And I said, "You'll probably notice that we're there because I sing really, really loud and off key most of the time." She said they would appreciate that. I just wanted to share that, because in our lives, one of the most important things that we need to make sure we do is that while we're doing everything else, we don't forget whose we are. We don't forget whose we are. I love the fact that I'm a member of the Lord's church. I love the fact that I have brothers and sisters no matter where I travel. Eddie told me, when I was telling him about the trip, he said, "Make sure if you get a chance that you worship with the Cody, Wyoming congregation." He's been there and worshiped with them, and he knows that congregation. I've had other people tell me, "Make sure anytime you are in such and such area, make sure you worship with such and such congregation there." Many of us have been to Branson. You've worshiped at the Greenhouse. Great congregation. as we travel through the world, we find brothers and sisters of like faith. Because as Daniel prophesied, wasn't even his dream. It was Nebuchadnezzar's dream. But Daniel prophesied about the dream, and he said, in the days of those kings, speaking of the Romans, the Lord of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never pass away. Isn't it great to be part of that kingdom today? Isn't it great to be a part of that? We're still continuing our study of Luke. We're talking about the things that Jesus was talking about here and the things that Jesus did. And the first thing we saw a few weeks ago, he talked about soils. And he talked about that some people are open to listen to the truth and other people are not. Some people are willing to accept a little bit of truth, but if it starts to be uncomfortable for them, they're not willing to continue. Others are willing to accept a little more truth, but when it starts to try to change and affect their lives, they don't want any part of it anymore. And other people, when they hear truth, seek truth and look for truth, and they grab a hold of it, and they hang on and they produce great crops. And that's that parable of the sower, we call it, but it's really a parable of soil. And then we see this. Last week we talked about the storms that come in life and how Jesus can calm the storms, not just on the sea, but the storms in our hearts, the storms of fear and doubt, the storms of trepidation, the storms that cause us sometimes to feel like there is no hope and that Jesus cares and that he can calm those storms. Then we saw, I guess that was the week before last, because last week we talked about a guy that was possessed of demons and how Jesus has power over anything and evil, especially over evil. You know, evil's real in the world. We talked about that. I don't want to talk about that again this week. I don't like talking about evil, but it's very real. And God's power is enough to sustain us through that and past that and in spite of that. And we need to understand that. Now, Jesus is coming back across the sea. He's coming back from this land of Gentiles. And the idea is, in the Gentile land, yeah, pigs were common and popular. But he's coming back over into Hebrew land. Not so much pigs welcome there. And he comes back across, and he's coming back home, and he finds a multitude of people on the shore waiting for him. Seems like that's the case everywhere he goes nowadays at this point in his gospel or in the gospel of the life of Christ, is that everywhere he goes, people want to hear him. People want to see him. They want to see the miracles. They want to experience the Jesus phenomena. They want to be a part of this. He's attracting crowds like nobody's business, and people are coming. Among this crowd are a heavy-hearted father and an afflicted woman. We're going to see both of them. Next week we'll talk more about the father. This week we're going to talk more about the woman that's there. And what's going to happen here is Jesus is going to have to come face to face with the real cold, hard facts of human life. Facts like sickness and sorrow and even death. And he's going to face all of these things. And some refer to this, when you start reading commentaries, they say this is a parenthetical miracle, the healing of the woman. Because Jesus is on the way to do something else, and they tell us about Jairus coming to him, and then they tell us about the healing that's going to happen later. And in the middle of it is this story about the woman. It's just parenthetical, is the way the scholars like to refer to it. But I prefer to think of it as just one more example of how God loves you and me, as insignificant as we are, enough that in the middle of whatever his business is, he stops to take time for us. That's what I see. I see a God who stops for us. A God who, at one time, stopped time for his people, because they needed that. A God who stopped to do whatever needed to be done because he cares. Because he cares. He still does. He still does care. He still does stop. In God's eyes, all souls matter. All souls. yours and mine. This woman, the crowd that was surrounding her, the people that were on the shore waiting for him when he got there, the people that were on the shore when he left, the people that weren't even there who were wherever in the world, because Jesus said, I came that they may have life more abundantly. I came to seek and to save the lost. That's what Jesus came for, and that's why he came. And so he cares about everyone, and he stops here for them. So let's look and see what we can learn from this story, this narrative about this woman. And the first thing we see is the object of the miracle. Verse 43 tells us, as we look at this, I have to go back in my Bible here. Verse 43, there was a woman who'd had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and though she had spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. You know who wrote that? Dr. Luke. Dr. Luke says she spent all her money on physicians. Now Mark takes it a step further. Mark says she had suffered many things at the hands of many physicians. We understand that a little bit, right? We'll talk about that again in a minute. Well, but the King James Version refers to it as a wasting disease. A wasting disease. It wasted her health, it wasted her finances, it wasted her happiness, it wasted her strength, it wasted even her relationships. And she'd been sick for 12 years. And you know, again, we can relate to this, suffered many things and spent all that she had on physicians. I mean, today, you go and you have tests. And then when the results come back, you go and you have more tests. And then when those results come back, you go for yet more tests. And if they can't solve it that way, you go for this procedure and that procedure, and maybe we'll try this and maybe we'll try that. And if that doesn't work, we'll try something else and we'll try something else. We had a family doctor back years ago, an old retired military doctor, and his words were, George, why do you think we call it practicing medicine? And, you know, it kind of felt like you were being practiced on sometimes. But the truth of the matter is we're all just a little bit different. And what works for me might not work the same way for Johnny. And what works for Johnny might not work the same way for Alan. And what works for Alan might not work the same way for Bill or for Rod or for you know, anybody. And so the doctors do the best they can. But here for 12 years, nothing has worked. It's an incurable disease. That's what's really going on. But worse yet, it was a flow of blood. Under Jewish law, this did not allow her to go out into public, nor attend worship services, nor even to eat with her own family. I'm not going to go into all the details about Jewish law, about a woman with a flow of blood like that. If you want to look at that, it's in Leviticus 15, verses 19 through 30 there. It's a pretty extensive list of prohibitions and rules and regulations concerning that. I don't want to talk about that here in the congregation, but if you look at that, you can see how horrible her life must have been, how miserable her life must have been. She might have been better had she lost both her legs and both her arms. That's how bad it was. And we see that. So she risks everything. She risks everything to approach Jesus. I don't think we can underestimate that. She could have been thrown out of the community, thrown out of her church. Her husband could have had her put to death for touching another man in public. Or her dad, if she didn't have a husband, could have had her put to death. She could have had her hands cut off. Or possibly been stoned to death by the community for touching this man, this rabbi, as he goes about his teaching. But she was desperate. She was desperate. She couldn't find help. She'd looked for help. She'd been to the doctor. She'd talked to everybody. She'd probably tried all kinds of... I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I bet if I ask for a show of hands, there are a bunch of us here who have tried all kinds of home remedies because what the doctors prescribed didn't work. And so we've tried all kinds of things. You know, I'll never forget somebody telling me if you got hiccups, you need to drink the water from the other side of the glass. I'm thinking, how in the world can you do that? But we've tried all kinds of things. Right now I'm dealing with plantar fasciitis on my left foot. I can hardly walk. I thought it was a stone bruise for a while, but it's plantar fasciitis. I can hardly walk. I've had many of you make comments. Hey, are you limping? Yeah, I'm limping. I hurt. My foot hurts. I'm doing the best I can. I've got all kinds of inserts for my foot and special sock to sleep with. And somebody said, hey, you need to get this special brace for your foot while you sleep. And I think somebody even suggested that if I hung upside down for 45 minutes a day, that I'd feel, but I don't know. You know what I do know? I know that this woman had been through so much for so long that she was desperate to try anything. That's what I know. That's what I see here. And then in verse 44, we see the manner of the miracle. Oh, how great that is. It says in verse 44, she came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her discharge of blood ceased. Immediately. Mark uses the word, the American Standard Version uses the word straight away. I like that. Straight away, immediately, all at once. Boom, it happened. The power of God happens immediately. Jesus didn't say anything. He didn't say, hey, you're healed or be healed. She didn't come to him and say, Savior, heal me. Nobody said anything. This is exceptional. She's too weak, too timid, too ashamed, too outcast, too whatever it is to even stand on the side of the road as Bartimaeus did and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. She wouldn't even do that. She didn't even do that. She just made her way through the crowd and came up behind him. She didn't approach him. She came up behind him to touch a part of his garment because she hoped, because she longed for healing, and she was willing to do whatever it took. She'd heard of this rabbi's teaching. Maybe she had heard his teaching. She'd heard of his power. Maybe she had seen exhibitions of the power that he had. She may not have known who he really was, because even his disciples at this point weren't sure who he really was. Remember their fear when he calmed the storm and they said, who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him? She may not have known who he really was, but she knew he was somebody special. She knew he was somebody sent from God. She knew that he had power. And she also knew that there was somebody there that she could put her faith in and trust. The Hebrew writer says, without faith it's impossible to please God. For he who would come to God must first believe that he is, and that he will reward those who diligently seek him. That's what she was doing. She was diligently seeking because of her faith. You know, James will tell us that faith without works is dead. We need to reach out on our faith, based on our faith, and that's what she did. She reached out based on her faith. She looked for hope. And then we see that the healing was immediate. Boom, just like that. You know, two things happened when she touched his garment. One, she immediately felt the power of God and knew she was healed. Immediately. The flow of blood stopped instantly. And two, Jesus immediately knew that she had been healed. You know, sometimes we might think that God's not paying attention. But no, he's always paying attention. He always knows. He always hears. He always sees. One of my favorite passages in the Old Testament is when Hagar is coming into this time when she's been kicked out of the house and she's got her son with her and she doesn't have any hope, and she stops at a spring called Bir Lahai Roi. And the spring is named Bir Lahai Roi because the words Bir Lahai Roi means the Lord sees, the Lord hears, the Lord understands. And sometimes I'll share that in funerals because God sees our cares. God hears our prayers. And God understands our pain. He's there with us. I love that as I look at this and I see this woman in her situation. 1 minute she's sick. 1 minute she's outcast. 1 minute she's somebody who has to holler unclean whenever anybody comes near her. And 1 second later, bam, she's whole again. 1 second later, the power of God. And in verses 45 through 47, we see her confession. It's kind of interesting there as she confesses what's going on and what has happened to her. Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" When all denied it. Did you hear that? When all denied it. What does all mean? It means everybody. Was she part of all? Yeah, she was. When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds around you and are pressing on you." And Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me." And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling. Now, look at this. She was close enough to touch him, and now she's got to come to him. You know what that means? It means as soon as she touched him, she took off. As soon as she was healed, she tried to make some distance. She knew something special had happened. She knew she'd been in the presence of God. And she tries to find some distance there. She came trembling and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. There's her confession. I've been healed. I've been saved. Everything has been taken care of for me, and I can't wait to run and hide. I've known Christians like that. Can't wait to run and hide. Can't wait to get away from God as soon as they come to God. But no, she's willing to confess when she's caught up with, so that others can receive the benefit as well. You know, her confession's made in humility. It's made in sincerity. It's made openly once she's identified. It was a great blessing to her. But I imagine it was a great blessing to everyone who was watching. They would have known her. The whole town would have known her. And here's the woman that walks around when she goes to the market. You can't go to the same shop she went to. I mean, this is worse than COVID-19. You know, they didn't have hand sanitizer. She had to walk around. She had to cover her face sometimes when she was in the presence, especially in the presence of men, and warn people that she was unclean. If you touch me, you can't go to church next week. If you touch me, you have to go to the priests and be ceremonially cleansed before you can come back to your family. Don't you dare hug me. All of those things she's gone through, they knew her. And now they see her whole. Now they see her pure. Now they see her made complete again. And that's a great blessing to them as well. And so then you see Jesus, I call this the dismissal. He kind of sends her on her way because he's in the middle of doing something, as the writers say, parenthetical. He's on the way to heal a dead girl. We don't know she's dead yet. We haven't been given that piece of information. We just know she's sick. He's on his way to go heal a dead girl, to raise her. And so he says to this woman, daughter. Daughter. There's a term of endearment. Daughter, I love you. You're mine. You belong. You're a part of. You're a part of my family. You're not just some stranger. How long had she waited for a tender word? Instead of someone saying, hey, you're unclean. Stay away from my shop. Buy your vegetables over there. I don't even want your business. You're unclean. Walk on the other side of the street. I've got my family over here. Don't you realize? You're unclean. Don't you realize you could infect somebody else? Well, it has different meaning today than it had just a year ago in our country. I saw on the news where a mayor not a mayor, a council member of Nashville, Tennessee, wants people charged with attempted murder if they're not wearing a mask. Not just when they come into a store, but when they're driving in their own car by themselves. Who are you going to infect if you're in your own car by yourself? But you got to wear a mask, according to her. That's attempted murder. I don't understand that. This lady probably would have. She's lived that. She's lived that. And Jesus gives her the most kind and enduring expression he can. He calls her daughter. And then he says, your faith has made you whole. Again, Hebrews 11:6 tells us that faith is what God is looking for in us. James tells us that our faith has to be accompanied by works. She's done all of those things. We see her faith, the great faith that she has, and Jesus identifies that. Gail and I watched a movie, an old Burt Lancaster movie the other night called Elmer Gantry. It was a movie that was outlawed when it first came out because Elmer Gantry was a revivalist, but he wasn't really a Christian. He was a really good vacuum cleaner salesman is what he was. He sold vacuums and toasters and stuff like that. He was a really good salesman, and he found out that there was good money in revivalism, so he got involved in revival. That's why they banned it, because at the time revivalism was sweeping the nation, and the revivalists didn't like it at all. But in the movie, you saw a few counts of healing. But for those of us who were privy to what's going on behind the scenes, because we're watching the movie, we could see that they were setting up those accounts before it happened. There wasn't any real healing. It was just he'd talk to somebody beforehand, and then the next thing you'd see, all of a sudden that person would start shouting out in the middle of his preaching and have to be healed, and he would heal the people. That's not what happened here. What happened here was not somebody making a big show to draw a crowd. What happened here was somebody sneaking up through the fringes, as quiet as a mouse, to get near, and then as soon as it happened, trying to get away just as quickly and just as quietly, just as privately. It wasn't about putting on a show for the crowds. It was about someone coming to God with all their heart, and God responding with all of his heart. That's what really happened here. And so then he tells her, go in peace. And King James, be whole of your plague. Be whole of your plague. So what do we learn from it? We learn the nature of sin. You know, sin it's a wasting malady like this. It wastes away. It costs us our time. It costs us our money. It costs us our relationships. Sin is incurable by any human means. And it doesn't matter how much time and effort and how many psychologists we see, how many psychiatrists we go see, how many different drugs we take, how many different philosophies we embrace. Sin is incurable by any human means. And we see that as we look at this. And then we see the kind of faith that will save us from sin. It's the kind of faith that motivates us to do something. The kind of faith that motivates us to trust in God and to do something about it, to reach out to God. It's a touching faith, an expecting faith. And then we see that it's not about the physical nature of our sin. It's about the spiritual nature. David writes in Psalm 51, against you and you only have I sinned. And at some point we need to realize that all of our sins separate us from God, Isaiah 59. We need to see that and understand that and realize that in faith, if we reach out to God, God can heal us. In faith, we reach out to God through baptism. Romans 6 in verse 3 says we're buried with him in baptism. Oh yeah, the old man of sin is put to death. We're buried. You don't bury somebody that's still alive. No, you put the old man of sin to death, and then you're buried into Christ, and then you're raised just like Jesus was to be a new creature, a new creation. Yes, you're still George. Well, that might not be a good thing. It was for me. Yes, you're still yourself. But no, your old self has been put aside, and now you're your new self. In faith, in communion, in prayer, in reading God's Word, and etc., in associating ourselves with the church, Christ's body. How wonderful it is to be a part of that. The divine nature, God himself is sensitive to our touch of faith when we have enough faith to reach out to him. That's what we get from this passage. If you want to know more about it, you can go to Mark chapter 9, or Matthew chapter 9. It's recorded there. It's also recorded in Mark chapter 5. You can read about it there. For now, I want to share the message with you. God cares. And it's not parenthetical. It's all the time. For you and for me, as significant or insignificant as we may be to the world around us, God still cares. As broken or as well as we may be, God still cares. If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we're going to give you a chance to do that. Maybe you've never been baptized into Christ, and it's time to do that. Don't put it off. It's time to do that. Maybe you're a Christian, you need to get your life right again. It's time to do that as well. If you need to respond, won't you do that while we sing to encourage you?
There's not a friend like the Lord.